Welcome back. I'm continuing the reading of The Fighter and the Family, picking up at chapter 7. Alright, so let's go. Chapter 7. Almost a decade had passed, and the year was now 1994. That year, Mr. Spiteful had been extremely busy. He was having a grand time indeed. He had worked it so that a number of calamities tumbled upon Nathaniel's head all at once, almost nullifying the few good breaks that had come his way in the years leading up. Among the good breaks which could count on one hand without using every finger, was the fact that Nathaniel had moved up to the rank of foreman on the construction site. It was just like saying he was a commanding officer, which sounded very nice when you put it that way. The pay was something he could live with, and the other fellows, who were typically younger, looked up to him in a fatherly, respectful way, as an amateur looks up to a professional. Nathaniel did not ask nor demanded this respect, but he did not reject it either. And while he was not overly sociable with the other men on the site, he was on good terms with them. The fact of him becoming foreman and the raise of pay and access to material at discount prices were among the driving forces that led Nathaniel to accomplish the next good feat, which was to construct a house of his own and move out of Hilda's house. Another contributing factor, equally important, was the fact that his children were growing and needed space and some amount of privacy. Slowly, very slowly, Nathaniel saved and gave Hortense the money to keep under the mattress, and he bought some lengths of steel this month and a few dozen blocks the following month, and some nails this week and some zinc next week, leaning them against the wall outside and covering them with sheets of old zinc to repel the thieves. But he still had to keep a keen eye on them and tie the dogs nearby. The bags of cement and the yards of steel and gravel he bought when he was just about to begin construction, leaving less chance for the cement to get wet and spoil, or for the children to trample in the gravel that had been dropped off by the hardware truck, or for dogs to mess in the sand. Nathaniel worked mostly alone during his spare time, but some of the fellows did chip in now and then, and Turnip, who was now 16, added his points to the equation. Though he was lazy and required constant threatening, in a matter of 4 months, Nathaniel had a new home for his family, with 2 bedrooms, a little hall and kitchen, and an inside bathroom. The house was built on the captured land on the opposite side of Cassava Peace to where Hilda lived, the side which could be accessed via Glen Drive. Hilda was not 100% thrilled with the prospect of Nathaniel moving out, for there were signs that the well of funds and endorsements that that had sustained her were beginning to dry up. Was beginning to dry down. Not up. Were beginning to dry down, in fact, was near the dregs. But she encouraged Nathaniel in a sisterly way, knowing that he was a man who had an independent spirit, and that she could only be expected to keep him under her roof for so long and no more. Hilda was left alone in the house, and after a while took in boarders, or rather, persons who started out on the pretense that they were boarders, until the second rent was due. Another good thing was that Hortense had taken to enterprise and her business was beginning to boom. She had acquired a big black head Singer sewing machine with a heavy metal foot pedal, which could only do straight stitches, but that was alright because the thing she sewed for sale only required straight stitch. Hortense made bags and purses and hats from straw and sisal, lined on the inside with calico, and embroidered on the outside with beautiful floral patterns in raffia. She sewed press studs on the small purses and zippers on the bags so they could be closed. The hats were in the shape of caps, regular sun hats, and even large brimmed hats, resembling Mexican sombreros that had been specially ordered for the tourist market. Some of the bags had circular bases and some had square bases, and the handles too were made of sisal or straw. They were very durable and beautiful. Agatha and Galvani helped to trim the frays from off the lengths of straw and sisal, which Hortense had bought in 4-inch diameter reels. Unwound, they could easily run 20 feet and more. Hortense would often dye the sisal and hang them up on the line to dry, or on the fence if somebody else was using the line, when they were still at Hilda's house. The girls also helped to embroider with the raffia. The strips of raffia were long and elegant and deliciously bright in color, so that it was not uncommon for uninitiated visitors to stand staring at the strands of them. The colors were rich and vibrant. The eyes of those needles had to be huge in order for the raffia to go through, and the needles themselves were much bigger than regular needles. Even the scissors had to be enormous to cut through the layers of straw, especially after the straw had been lined with newspaper to make it firm. Hortense had pretty much taught herself the craft, though she had been introduced to it when she first entered the craft market so many years ago. But she had always been good at needlework, and she was a very creative woman. She had not bothered to get a stall in the craft market. Instead, she sold her goods to people who already had stalls there, sometimes on consignment, sometimes by special order. She was very productive and was earning a decent keep, and she always sang as she sewed. Bruce had been in prison for 10 years and no one heard from him, and after the first 3 years, no one had even bothered to try and hear from him. They had stopped writing letters and visiting because he never responded to the letters, and the warden said Bruce didn't want to see anyone. But someone who Nathaniel knew, who worked at the prison, said that Bruce was all right. When he could, Nathaniel sent money for Myrtle and the children, who now often came to spend some time in Kingston during their school break. Now for the calamities, which needed 2 hands to count, using almost every finger. Hilda had taken several jobs as a domestic helper. In fact, had taken 4 such jobs in the space of 2.5 years. She was fired the first time because she was caught having sex with the lady's husband. The second time because she was caught having sex with the lady's 19-year-old son. The third time because she was found to have stolen tins of corned beef, sardines, baked beans, and several pounds of rice and flour over a period of time from the pantry. And the fourth time because she was caught having sex with the lady's husband in the lady's bed on a Saturday when she was not even supposed to be at work. Why is Hilda like that? Who creates these characters? Who creates these kind of characters? Why is Hilda so bad, man? She's bad. She's a bad woman. She's a bad woman. Alright. But Hilda only confided this to Nathaniel after she had lost the 4th job, and even then only because she said she had something to confess, which she had kept bottled up for years. Hilda was in a state, and Nathaniel was not too sure that the situation did not warrant some kind of professional psychological intervention, higher heads than his. But Hilda said that she was fine, except that she had been hoarding her sorrows for much too long and needed to vent. "Do you know why I left Walkerswood?" she asked Nathaniel, almost rhetorically, for she knew he could not have known, and she still knew she was about to tell him, but she still wanted to hear what he would have said just in case. And then, quite bluntly, as if she had reached the end of a long road and was turning now to face her relentless pursuer, come what may, she said, "I left because Papa was having sex with me and I couldn't take it anymore." "You drunk, Hilda," Nathaniel scoffed. "It is bad enough what you have gotten yourself involved in, but to drag poor Papa's name into this, you know that is wrong." "Papa was having sex with me from I was 9, Hilda insisted, "and Mama knew about it too. As a matter of fact, sometimes she was the one who sent me to him. She said he was paying the bills and giving us food, and he was my father, and it was his duty to break me in before any other man." "Hilda, quit the nonsense. Mama and Papa would do no such thing," Nathaniel shouted, rising from the bed on which he had been sitting, for he had gone over to Hilda's house to try to reason some sense into her. "He was a wicked man," Hilda shouted back. "A wicked man, like all men are wicked. He was sexing me even after Mama died, and after he married Miss Ruby. You could not know, you were still too little. I was so glad when God struck him down. He got what he deserved. He was too blasted wicked." Hilda started to cry. "Don't say any such thing about Mama and Papa," Nathaniel kept saying, in an almost pleading, boy-like tone that Hilda could not remember having heard it in him before. Nathaniel stood and left. He could not believe it. His mother and father would have done no such thing. He knew that Hilda was just a loose woman who was trying to blame her looseness on somebody else. And as a matter of fact, he did not want his children associating with her either, and he told her so that very day. "You stay your way and we'll stay our way," he said. Hilda did not stay her way. She took Galvani under her wings, and it caused much upheaval in the Hector family. Galvani was 13, tall and lanky with dark legs that looked like pillars of chocolate. Her Auntie Hilda, because she wanted to irritate Nathaniel, but also because she was just good at corrupting the minds of minors, encouraged the girl to show off those lovely legs by wearing the skimpiest shorts and miniskirts that she could find. "If you've got it, flaunt it, girl child," Auntie Hilda cheered. Now, Hortense had seen to it that her children start life as ardent Sunday school goers, and she shipped them off every week in their Sunday best to learn their verses, though she herself had just about abandoned the religious aspects of life, except to sing hymns when she sewed. Galvani in particular had taken to the straight and narrow, like a little pilgrim, and there had even been talk that she would break the record as being the youngest one in the family to be baptized. Hortense had been baptized at age 15. As luck would have it, Galvani's route to church took her past Auntie Hilda's house, and sometimes she would stop for a drink of lemonade on her way back home, and Auntie Hilda would let the girl have a taste of the white rum she was drinking. Auntie Hilda decided it was time Galvani knew the facts of life, as she was sure that the mother, holier than thou as she was, would not see fit to warn the girl of the evils of the world, and would let her fall into the pits due to lack of knowledge and street smarts. So you can imagine that whenever Galvani left Auntie Hilda's house, her vocabulary had expanded significantly, and her imagination had increased triple-fold. not to mention her desire to grow up quick and experience those things firsthand. Needless to say, baptism was put on the back burner, and hot girl fashions were the order of the day for Galvani. She coiled up in bed all day long reading romance novels, flipping the pages eagerly so she could get to the nice part, or polishing her nails, or curling her hair, or doing any of those other things that Auntie Hilda had said the modern girl needed to do to stay on top of things. Never mind that Auntie Hilda was nowhere near the top of things at this point in time. While she stayed in school and surprisingly maintained her grades, Galvani was difficult for her parents to manage. She had grown rude and disrespectful, calling her mother a backward old house rat and her father a vicious tyrant, and complaining to the neighbors that she was an oppressed child. She was an oppressed child who was on the verge of suicide. Agatha, 14, was not as wily or as feisty as her little sister, but she was more voluptuous and more naive, two things that never went well together. Wherein lay the danger? Men swarmed her because she had the double bonus of being heavy in body and light in mind. In other words, in the minds of the smutty fellows with whom she came in contact, she was loaded with treasure, but the door to her vault was weak. The first man who gained easy access to Agatha's vault was Stickapin. Stickapin had gained his name because he could always be seen loitering somewhere, infamously idle. He was 20 years older than Agatha. He was a confirmed rumhead, and he had already fathered 3 children with a woman in an adjoining community whom he did not support. As Agatha giggled along to school, Stickapin would try to lure her away into the bushes with sweet words and extra pocket money, and it was not long before she did agree to go with him into the bushes because he had something to show her. That thing that he had to show her, Agatha realized to her dismay, was quite a remarkable thing in that it had the latent ability to cause her belly to rise, to the extent that her uniform could no longer fit, to the extent that she was expelled from school. Nathaniel, outraged, quickly got to the bottom of it and demanded a name. When he got word that the worthless son of a gun who had impregnated his teenage daughter was none other than Stickapin, he let the fellow know that wedding bells would soon be ringing, and it was really pointless for a man to try and oppose Nathaniel. One thing Nathaniel had not left in Walker's Wood was his cutlass, so learn that. And he may not have been a religious man, but he had his principles, and principles dictated that he was not to have an unmarried teenage daughter and a bastard grandchild. As soon as Agatha got to marrying age, papers would be filed. That was tragedy enough, but it didn't stop there. As was mentioned, Mr. Spiteful had launched an all-out attack on Nathaniel. Agatha gave birth to her baby at 6 months and 2 weeks, which meant that the child was premature and had to be kept in intensive care for 2 months. On top of that, the child had suffered a little brain damage due to her long and arduous birth, and as she grew, she was classified by the doctors who attended to her as being mildly mentally retarded. Agatha, unable to cope, seemed to have sunken into deep depression and was even more listless than before. Not wanting to be outdone by his siblings, Turnip had devised some strategies all of his own too. He was restless and wayward, and vied with his Uncle Bruce for top prize in laziness. He attached himself to a gang similar to the Fire Posse, except that this gang was not quite so ambitious, and for the time being, its members settled for breaking entry into their mothers' purses, and climbing people's fruit trees with what little there were in cassava piece. As Hortense was a baking woman, she had taken to making pastry, which she called natty patty, which was a smash success in the community. Natty patty was made by kneading dough and cutting it into little circles, then filling the middle with grated coconuts that had been tossed in heated sugar. Then Hortense would fold the other side of the dough over into the shape of a patty, seal it down by pressing along the edges with a fork, and fry it. That was natty patty, and it was for sale and was going like hot bread. Hortense didn't have hands to sell them. Well, the connection between turnip and the natty patties went like this. He would sit on the wall and wait patiently while the natty patties were being fried. He had a habit of drawing near when the cooking was going on. And as soon as his radar alerted him to the fact that the patties had been done and were cooling, he would descend upon the house with a ravenous hunger, only surpassed by that of a swarm of locusts, and he would sink into one patty and then another, until Hortense was lucky if she had any patties left to sell at all. Now, as Nathaniel saw it, there were two ways to rectify the situation: the hard way and the harder way. The hard way was to grab the boy and throw him to the ground, sit in his chest, and beat him with the flat part of the cutlass. Nathaniel had seen it done in Walker's Wood with remarkable success. No boy, after undergoing this treatment, ever saw reason not to behave. The harder way, for Nathaniel that was to try to reason sense into the boy, to make him see that this life was headed towards disaster, and that his mother's heart was at stake. He could reason with the boy and get him to change his evil ways and be good. This was the hard way because Nathaniel knew that he would be lying and he didn't want to be a hypocrite. Who was he to encourage a boy to be good, or that Mr. Spiteful would spare you when he went on one of his famous rampages? So Nathaniel opted for the hard way, but it did not work because this was not Walker's Wood. Sometimes I think that I'm the only fighter in this damn family, Nathaniel sighed. The only fighter in this damn family. Alright, so that's the end of chapter 7. The end of chapter 7. So we're going to end this video right here and pick up at, or should I just read chapter 8? Should I start reading chapter 8? Alright, let me read chapter 8. And then when chapter 8 ends, we'll just pick up in the next video. So chapter 8. About a year after that, everyone was surprised when Bruce was released from prison on good behavior after only serving 15 years of his sentence. Bruce had gone through 3 stages of transition, and he proved to be one of only a handful of men who were ever really reformed by a penal institution. At first, when he went into prison, Bruce had still been naive and awkward, and he was pretty much pushed around by everyone, even by those who were themselves pushed around by other prisoners. There was a hierarchy, and he lingered somewhere near the very bottom. Bruce formed no alliances, having learned his lesson and grown timid of the notion of gangs and so on his own. He was a sitting target for attack, both physically through the beatings as well as through jeering and mouthing. So the first phase was that he coiled inwards and spoke very little, and suffered the abuse as a matter of course, not fighting back or rebutting, just allowing himself to be a human punching bag. This phase lasted for 2 years. Then, triggered perhaps by the death of a blockmate from beatings received from other inmates, and the nonchalance of warders and hypocrisy from the prison officials as to the real cause of the death, Bruce went from submissive to subversive, and in a very short time his second phase had begun. This lasted for 5 years, during which time Bruce had become so bitter and so assertive and so rebellious that very few people dared brush near him for fear of having their jugular vein ruptured by Bruce's teeth. They called him Bruce the Savage. He had ceased being afraid of the hardened criminals, himself having joined their ranks, and Bruce even gained admission into a sort of high profile, though low profile would be more precise, inner circle of bad guys, among which were said to be notorious killers whose deeds had been of the order to have earned them national infamy before their incarceration. Yes, Bruce rubbed shoulders with Lapa Lapa and Bulletproof and Copper Dog. And he gained inside information from the bad guys themselves as to the intricate details of some of the most notorious and heinous crimes committed across the nation. He was in the big league, sure as sure. But something, age perhaps, and the realization that his sentence was not a life sentence, but one that would be served and would eventually be up, caused Bruce to introspect and weigh the matter of reformation, because he saw that there was a strong possibility he would live to see his wife and daughters again. And he wanted to make it up to them by being a changed man when next they met. He wanted to be squeaky clean. So he quit the inner circle, prestigious as it was, and he avoided the company of notorious killers by immersing himself in voluntary work. Bruce helped out in the library, packing away books at first and helping to catalog and other stray jobs. He basically hid away in the library whenever he was not confined to his cell, and he even started reading some of the books himself. The next 8 years of his life had been one of the most reflective and industrious and conscientious in all his existence on the planet. So much so that his example began to touch the lives of other prisoners. His parole officer was so inspired, in fact, that she recommended that he be considered a reprieve. In 1995, Bruce was declared a free man. He had not written to anyone of his conversion to the level-headed way of life. Bruce only wanted to present himself to his family as a clean new man, a man who was now ready to assume the responsibilities that he had so carelessly abandoned, the responsibilities of a father, husband, and brother. Nathaniel only knew that Bruce came to his house one day out of the blue. Hilda had directed him to where Nathaniel now lived, and Bruce had only said that he had been released from prison and that he was going back to Walkerswood to buy some pigs and some goats and about 3 dozen chickens. He had been saving money in prison all along, and his only wish was that Myrtle would find it in her heart to forgive him and take a chance on him again. He had squandered 15 years of their marriage, more in fact, if you counted the years he had wasted in Cassava Peace, chasing girls and playing the fool with his cronies. And all this time, Myrtle had stood steadfast by their 2 girls and raised them single-handedly. Really, till now, she had 2 beautiful grandbabies tugging at her frock tail. And Bruce had missed it all, had deprived himself of seeing his daughters emerge into full-grown women, ready to take their place in the world and add their 3 pennies worth to the scheme of things. He had some catching up to do, indeed. 2 weeks after Agatha's 18th birthday, there was a little wedding ceremony, and she and Stickapin were sent marching down the aisle, shotgun style. Though much of the burden of the festivities had fallen upon Nathaniel's shoulder, he was consoled in the fact that he was doing good by his daughter, and it gave him great relief to see that she was now a married woman. As no one had sat Stickapin down and explained to him the social and legal implications of being a married man, and in spite of the fact that he was now 38 years old with 4 children, a wife and a baby mother to support, he pretty much lived life just as he had done prior to his big day. He still frequented rum bars and came in drunk very regularly, so that what little money he did make from wherever it was he made it was squandered on liquor anyway. Stickapin had moved into Nathaniel's house, oblivious to the tendency of most married men to move out rather than in, and Nathaniel had only accommodated this because he had supposed it would be a temporary arrangement. But one man's notion of temporary might be totally different from another man's notion. Some people do temporary things for all of their lives. Nathaniel's notion of temporary in this case referred to a period of time less than but not exceeding 1 year, during which time Stickapin would have had a good decency of character to claim a piece of captured land as his own and build himself a house for his family. Stickapin's notion of temporary referred to a period of time spanning anywhere from 1 to 5 to 20 years, during which time he would construct a makeshift wooden shack adjoining Nathaniel's house, in which he would live with Agatha and the baby until such time. The shack had to be makeshift so as to facilitate the idea of easy demolition upon the son-in-law putting up his own house, as well as to facilitate the fact that the son-in-law had better things to spend his money on than a solid structure to shield his family from the elements. The pieces of bagasse board that he had used to construct the shaft had been of such poor quality and so infested with termites that it was a scientific marvel that the shack stood up in the first place. Agatha, whose emotional maturity was still late in coming, did not object to the guidance from her father or lack of guidance from her husband. She assumed the roles of wife and mother with the same innocence that a child accepts the role of a fairy or a princess in a school play. Really, it was Hortense who did much of the mothering to Agatha's baby, and as it was her pot that Stickapin waited on, and her pans that his trousers were washed in, and her light and water and toilet that he used, it would sound crude, but it would not be incorrect to say that Hortense did much of the wifing too. The child was named Hortense after her grandmother. She was called Tensie for short. She was only mildly mentally retarded, as the doctors had said, but enough for them to suspect that at least some aspects of her mental and physical growth would be stalled if not thwarted. Tensie was physically a lovely child with bright eyes and a curious personality, except that she was very thin at first. Her milestones were only slightly behind those of other children. She reached for things, smiled, drank from her cup, and learned to walk, but there was a stiffness in her arms and legs that would aggravate an unknowing caretaker who tried to put a dress on her or ask her to lift her legs. Her mother, impatient, would slap her. "Get your hand into the blouse, Tensie," Agatha would say. "Bend your arm, don't stiffen out so." It took her long before she realized that the child couldn't help it. If you looked at Tensie and looked at 4 other girls her age as she grew, you would not suspect that there was really any crucial difference between them, and maybe there really wasn't. If Tensie smiled, only someone deeply knowledgeable of these things would notice that her teeth were slightly further apart than other girls' teeth. But only Hortense suspected that the girl may have been labeled wrongly. And perhaps, if they had all held to that opinion and treated her like a normal child, Tensi would not have suffered the way she did. The doctors had said that Tensi was retarded, and everyone repeated that Tensi was retarded and kept saying it over and over until it became in their minds an established fact. So the least symptom of a common cold, a slight fever or discomfort somewhere, was seen as justifiable to rush Tensi off to the emergency room of the children's hospital, where the doctors, always keen to do what they can to deepen a parent's anxiety, would admit the child, saying that they needed to run tests. The tests would invariably come back negative, but the doctor would prescribe medication just in case they had overlooked something. They didn't want to take any chances of a cold becoming pneumonia or a fever resulting in meningitis. With all the exposure to the bleak hospital environments and the overdose of preventative medication, Tensi stood little chance of experiencing a normal childhood. She didn't quite have the balance in her gait as other children, but maybe if she had been